Hello, everyone. Welcome to GlobeDocs panel discussion on Pushout with Dr. Monique Morris, whose book the film was based on, and Principal Patton of Columbus City Preparatory School for Girls. Pushout is a film that looks at the disparities facing Black girls. It confronts the ways in which a misunderstanding around Black girlhood leads to inequities in punishment and sympathy, and just disrupts their education, period. And also the erasure of Black girls in the conversation from the school to prison pipeline, which ultimately has effects on us as we become Black women in the workspace and in the corporate world. I want to start with Dr. Monique Morris and just talk a little bit about the inspiration behind your book and what inspired you to write it. And I know everyone hasn't seen your TED Talk, but I think the antidote of your 6th grade bully is a really good place to start.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be able to join in this conversation remotely. It's always a pleasure to be in any space with Principal Patton. And so I'm thrilled that we're able to do this together. You know, I tell the story in the TED Talk of being in the 6th grade and being a survivor of sexual violence and abandonment in other parts of my life, and being in school and dealing with a boy who had been harassing and bothering me for quite some time. And then one day during PE class, he stepped on my shoe and refused to apologize, and we got into a fight. And, you know, I'd say it wasn't the first fight that I'd ever been in, but it was the first fight at school. And, you know, I remember feeling rage with him, feeling rage in general. And the educators that were working with me, you know, didn't call the police on me. It didn't interrupt my study. It didn't keep me from moving forward with my life. They broke up the fight and they asked me what happened. And they used the things that you know, they knew about me that were positive to intervene and engage with empathy in a way that, in many ways, the increasingly punitive structure of discipline in our schools has forgotten. That we're talking about working with young people. And when girls get into fights, it's usually because of something that is underlying, you know, a deep issue and disruption in their own lives that we have to work with them to address. The educators working with me understood that. And then, you know, that was in the 80s, and we sort of moved into a space where there was now this growing rhetoric about the need to arrest and respond to young people with these very harsh ways of intervening that don't elevate connection and relationship. And so, you know, I start the TED Talk with that. And in many ways, you know, I would probably say the way that those educators worked with me is what I want to invite folks to consider when they're working with young people who are exhibiting you know, negative student behaviors, or who are engaging with each other in ways that we want to try to interrupt. And I share that because a lot of folks, you know, think about me, and folks who might interact with me in my professional life, you know, would of course probably, you know, see themselves, you know, in some of the stories that I tell. But you know, it's important for folks to understand that not only is this an exercise of scholarship, and not only is this an exercise of, you know, sort of intellectual curiosity and engagement and deep care about our community, but it's also, you know, something that as a child, I'm very familiar with, and recognize that had the responses been different to me, or had the responses been consistent with the way that we interact with so many girls today, back then, I may not be here to talk about these kinds of things. I may not have had the trajectory that I had, because it would have been disrupted over something that it didn't need to be. So, you know, I share that in the spirit of connection, but also in the spirit of inviting us to think more strongly about how we're working with our young people. I started writing Pushout because, you know, I saw data. And I, you know, was very deeply concerned about the growing rates of school discipline and exclusionary discipline, especially the suspensions, expulsions, arrests, referrals to law enforcement that I was seeing among girls at a time when people were not really willing to engage girls in the conversation about what we were calling the school to prison pipeline. Much of the conversation and rhetoric revolved around boys. Much of the investment strategy involved and really revolved around boys and young men of color. And it didn't acknowledge that girls were experiencing similar conditions, particularly Black girls, and that Black girls were experiencing a type of erasure that I felt was violent, a type of neglect that I felt was unconscionable. And so in writing Pushout, the book, and then the second book, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls, it became clear that we needed to explore this in multiple ways. I know people learn in different ways, and I'm grateful for everyone who picked up the book and did the deep dive, or the books and did the deep dive into the material. But I also really wanted to make sure that we could extend this conversation to folks who might have an hour to watch a film.
Speaking of the data, Georgetown Law has done a lot of work around this, and Black girls are 7 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. And then if they end up getting arrested and criminalized and go through the court system, prosecutors will only dismiss 30% of the cases against Black girls, but white girls who do the same exact thing get a pass 70% of the time, which makes me want to talk to Principal Patton about what she's done at Columbus City Prep School for Girls in the decision to no longer punish students for having a bad attitude, and the focus on restorative conferencing and behavioral intervention. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and how what you were seeing led you to sort of really lay down a blueprint that could be what we see carried out through schools nationwide if we get it right?
I think that is very important to, when you're looking at your discipline, really have an honest discussion about why your discipline records are, where they are. And so for us, and research shows that Black girls are suspended more for subjective measures. So it's very easy to say disrespect, insubordination, those loose terms that are not defined by policy, defined by perception and opinion. And so when we looked at the areas that most of our Black girls were getting suspended for, they were in those subjective areas. And we looked at their counterparts, and we saw that there was some insubordination. It just looked different. So for example, we would have a young Black girl say, I'm not doing this assignment, for whatever reason. Could be that she didn't understand it, or she was it was challenging. And we would have a white student who would quietly just not turn it in. And what we were seeing is that transferred into discipline for the Black student, but not necessarily the white student. We kind of excused it away of why she didn't turn in her work. Well, we know she knows it. She may be suffering from anxiety or so forth. So we kind of excused it away. So the first thing we had to do was check our own bias. And that's when we incorporated the Pushout book, because it really gave us a perspective of Black girls and how they display their emotions. And so we started with regulating emotions and how do you have a voice that is productive. And I think that's something that goes from being a young Black girl into a Black woman who's navigating, the corporate world or in a career. How do you politically get the things that you need and still say the things that you believe in? So we started in that avenue of looking at insubordination, and we really had to go referral by referral to say, so what's the replacement behavior? Well, how would you have preferred her to say it? And then have that conversation with the student as well, and give her the opportunity to say to the teacher, it would have been more effective if you asked me in this way. And so it was a communication tool that we started with. And we provided each girl with a person of support, and that person was their sounding board. So they can go to their person of support and vent in the manner they needed to, and then get advice on how to address the issue with the adult they were having challenges with. And so what that did was cut down our rate of discipline immensely. And then that told them, it also taught them how to communicate. So then when they had a problem with their peers, it was the same measure. They would go to a teacher and they would say, I'm having problems with this person, or Principal Patton, I don't want to get into a fight. So can you call this person down and we can have a conversation about what's going on? And then we all walk away either agreeing or agreeing to disagree. And so for us, those were the beginning stages One was tackling, the bias. We used Pushout as our basis for honest conversation. And then we looked at how we were disciplining students, and then, working on decreasing that and changing our behavior as adults, not focusing on children behavior, but focusing on our behavior first as adults, so we can model then for the girls.
And I love that you talk about our behavior as adults, because I think about what we see with little Black girls, even in preschool. Like, these numbers are this high even in preschool. Like, we have Black preschoolers getting suspended for things that white preschoolers are doing too, but they're getting sent home, and 6-year-olds getting arrested, which is not uncommon. Unfortunately, it's not just one case of a 6-year-old being arrested or one case of a kindergarten being arrested. And then I look at numbers like what we see in Lean In's 2018 report, where it's like, 45% of women of color are the only one in their office, the only woman of color in their office. And they often feel they have to prove themselves and prove their competence and feel scrutinized. And it starts at 4 and 5, and we sort of groom this erasure and adultification, and also a dehumanization, like this, less in need of nurturing, kind of building a box of like, oh, you're combative. Anything you say makes you combative. Your school motto is "Real Queens Fix Each Other's Crowns." I wonder if both of you might talk about the importance of sort of pouring into each other as Black women and Black girls, and how we can take that throughout the education system, not just with Black girls and Black women, but throughout the education system period. Like, how can we get other teachers of color, even white teachers, administrators, to understand the importance of helping rather than criminalizing and vilifying?
Dr. Morris, you can go.
Okay. So you talked about the Georgetown study that was the study on adultification. The Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality has done a series that examines how adultification appears in the lives of Black girls. I talked about it in Pushout, calling it age compression. For those who may not be, familiar with the term, adultification refers to the reading of girls' behavior, particularly Black girls, as more adult-like, which, as you were saying, Janae, renders them vulnerable to being perceived as more independent, or to know more about adult subjects than their white counterparts, to be considered less in need of nurturing, protection, and comfort. And yes, it is dehumanizing. And yes, it begins when girls are as young as 5, and it peaks when they're between the ages of 10 and 14, which is also the peak time that many girls are at higher risk of involvement in commercial sexual exploitation. They're dealing with childhood sexual assault. And we have an increasing number of law enforcement in schools and punitive dress code policies that disproportionately impact Black girls. So you've got all this stuff happening in their lives at a time when their brains are developing and trying to become more independent, trying to understand who they want to be, is growing and developing in ways that, really ultimately respond to this notion of safety. But we can't even really enter the conversation about safety because we've constructed an environment that is so punitive and or so reflective of our own adult behavioral biases about what we think girls should be, or about who we think they are, excuse me, rather than fully exploring how we can engage with them as learners and young scholars. I wrote a piece about that was about, I called it "Countering the Adultification of Black Girls in Schools," and talked a bit about how we engage in developing the structures, many of the structures that I think are present and developing at the Columbus City Prep School for Girls that schools could pick up and move forward with in support of their girls. Making sure that we have spaces, a lot of times people think about safety in terms of something that can be implemented. And one of the things that I sort of challenge us to think about is how we can co-construct safety rather than implement safety. When you co-construct safety, it means that you're in conversation and building relationships that are the fundamental component of someone feeling that they can release and relax and actually learn. What we know about the developing brain, what we know about the human brain, is that if someone doesn't feel safe if they're constantly on guard and their, sort of response brain amygdala is triggered because they're feeling stress or they're feeling discomfort or disruption in some way, then they won't be able to learn. They won't be able to engage in the discipline and the rigor that we want young people to engage in so that they can emerge. How we begin to make young people feel safe in schools, when I talk to girls around the country, the primary thing that I hear from them is that they want their school to be a place where people love them and where they know people care about them. The love and care has to come first. And for so many of us, we've constructed a space where that is, maybe second or third after, whether they're wearing the right uniform, whether they are, sort of walking into school, visibly present and able to be there regardless of what they had to do to get to school that day. And so, what we've got to do as adults is really try to think about how we create this space that is more like the sanctuary that girls are asking for, rather than the punitive prisons that they call it. And you do that by, again, creating spaces where young people can come together in conversation about their experiences, where there are counseling services and other adults on the school campus who can engage with them in loving and caring ways, where there are practices built into the day and into the school structure that invite young people to reset, connect with their breath, to understand their humanity, and to begin to learn these practices early on. One of the most beautiful things that I remember seeing in Principal Patton's school when I was walking through there was that she had these pillows and sort of side spaces where young people could sit if they needed a moment to check out. And I've never seen that in any school, where along the corridors of the school, you could have a moment if you needed to step outside of the classroom and take a breath. There was a pillow where you could sit and just kind of regroup. And it was so simple and so beautiful. And so I think so much of a reflection of why it is that she's been able to elevate many of these relationships that ultimately lead to a true safety rather than just the appearance of safety because of the presence of surveillance, structures of surveillance is what I call them. And so I think it's a reminder that we have to connect back to the core pieces of this work, which is about building relationships with the young people that we are invited and tasked to educate, rather than just control their behaviors in a given day.
And I think creating those safe spaces was something that really helped our young ladies, and that there was trust. So I can trust you to go into the hallway and read your novel and answer your questions and do your work. And when you're ready to return, you go back into class in that environment. So I think, the opportunity is there. I think as educators, we have to be open-minded enough to build that trust, through expectations and dialogue that, this is something here for you. And they're going to respect that, and they're going to respect their space. And I think that we have to talk to our teachers about authentic relationships. And especially for teachers of non-color, there are things that you may not feel connected, but there are common things that we have all together. So I have a teacher who is of not color, and she had cats, and my girls don't like cats, and but our cat passed away, and that common connection was grief, because they understood how it felt to lose something. And so the bonds can be authentic. It doesn't have to be appropriated where it's something that you watch that you think is a part of the Black culture, but it could be those common things that we all share and relate to, and that builds that relationship. And so the students are always going to go to you first. Research states that the teacher is the most influential person in the classroom and their instruction and their learning. And so if the teachers aren't providing that, sure, the kids can come to me 100 times a day, but as soon as they step back into that classroom, they're going to build off of the trauma they have with that educator. And so we're trying to truly solve problems in the classroom, and it has to begin with that adult in the classroom and just sewing into the young ladies. And you also have to have cultural relevant material. They have to see themselves in what they're learning. They have to understand the greatness that they come from, and they have to understand that Black women throughout history who have made it have gone through journeys where they often thought they wouldn't make it. And so when you're saying these things to them every day, we have a morning meeting every day. I meet with all of my students for the first 15 minutes of a day, and we read a quote. And then they talk about the quote in advisory period, or I show a video, or just sowing that positive into them. Like, we fix each other's crowns. So if you see someone, who needs help, you help them. That's what we do here. So to start our day off every morning with that type of message, it sets the tone and the focus, for the day.
It's also important to elevate what you do with your girls around promoting advocacy, right? I remember having a conversation with you once about how important it was to engage girls as a part of the creation and cultivation of culturally responsive space, to honor the importance of advocacy among Black girls. For a long time, I was saying that, and I hear this from girls everywhere, where they'll say, we'll speak up, we say things when people don't want us to say things. As you were saying, in your school, some of the girls will say, I'm not doing this work, right? Rather than just not doing the work. And so there's a particular way that Black girls are vocal and expressive of their feelings. And, Black women continue this journey. We celebrate them during Black History Month. We celebrate them during Women's History Month. We talk about these courageous women who stood up, and our girls are understanding that to be an important part of their cultural practice, that when we see something that is wrong, we speak truth to that power and engage it and embrace it, whether people like it or not. And, when they do that with their own experience, we punish them. But what I think you do differently is provide a space to workshop that advocacy, right? And to work with the girls, if they do see something that is being disruptive in their lives, creating a space where they can understand the root of it and to, move forward with that. We didn't highlight that in the film, but I do talk about it a bit in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues when I'm talking about some of the work there. So I think it's important. I'm not the moderator today, but I think it'd be really great to hear Principal Patton talk just a little tiny bit about how she cultivates advocacy, because I think that's what a lot of educators and particularly administrators might miss, which is why the adultification bias is able to move forward and cause so much harm in schools.
I do want to talk about how she cultivates advocacy. We also have some reader questions. If everybody wants to stay on for like an extra five minutes, that'd be great. I'm willing to sit here an extra 5 minutes. But I also want to, before we get to advocacy, because I think what I'm about to say plays into that, and we open it up for Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about the Ending Pushout Act, which I think correlates nicely with advocacy and speaking truth to power.
That's right. Yeah.
This is more than a film, and it's going to take more. We need schools to, I think, I told Principal Patton before this started, I think she has a blueprint, and I think schools need to follow her blueprint, but we also need policy. And the Ending Pushout Act, you and our illustrious Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, challenging schools to ban most suspensions and expulsions for our youngest learners in pre-K through 5th grade, banning suspensions and expulsions in all grades for minor infractions of dress codes and hair policies, and banning the heinous practice of corporal punishment, which is still legal in 19 states. So Principal Patton, with us talking about the Pushout Act, can you also lay the groundwork for kind of what you're cultivating with advocacy?
So I think, again, when you reiterate to students the importance of an education and what your expectations and standards are, they then start to adopt those. So what we've seen in year 2 of really trying to push for this advocacy and transformation is that students will come and say to me, well, I don't understand. I had one student, for example, who's very vocal. She said, I don't understand why we're still on this learning standard when I mastered it through the summative exam, and I should be able to move on to the next learning standard. And so, number one, getting teachers used to being, presented with conversation about a student advocating for themselves, because I could go in and see a teacher not teaching to the expectation, but you as a student, if you're sitting there and this is what you're accepting as your education, I'm going to hold both of you accountable. And so teaching them that skill set, I think, has been really positive. I know I had some students in the office in their safe space, and I get a call from my executive director, and she said, hey, what are you guys doing? Are you doing a project? And I'm like, I'm not sure, in reference to what. And what happened was my students took that time on the internet, and instead of being on YouTube or any of those other, websites, they decided to email the board members and talk about the disparity of urban education. And they talked about it in terms of having food deserts in their neighborhoods, but yet when they look at the lunch schedules of suburban counterparts, what they were being served and how other districts were one-to-one learning, and, what was our plan to get there. And so I think that advocacy part is valid because they have, valid points. And I think as adults, we just have to listen and education. And so we did a all natural day. So we talked about the natural hairstyle. So let the staff understand what that means. We're all going natural. And so makeup, hair, everything, no matter what ethnicity, this is what we're doing all day. And the teachers understood you have to be happy with who you are and the way you look. And it's about that, not what society feels. So they felt uncomfortable and they understood, yes, I do need my hair a certain way, or I do need my makeup on, because when I didn't have it on, I felt different. I didn't feel productive. I didn't want to look at people in the eye. I didn't want to participate and stand in front of the class to teach. So I think being courageous to do those exercises so that they understand the advocacy and not be immediately defensive of it. I think you start to change policies within your own school building, which you totally have control over, in your classroom and in the school. So that's kind of where we started with the advocacy.
Yeah, as that 12-year-old who used to write letters to the mayor when I saw people sleeping on the street, I totally appreciate that.
Yes.
I want to start. We have a few questions from our viewers, and the first one has to do with funding. Principal Patton, did it cost you any money to change the way you did things at your school?
The only expense we had initially was purchasing the Pushout book. Mindset is free. Belief Gap is free. Practicing is free. We did minor things like get the cushions and things like that. We wrote a grant for social emotional learning through a foundation, and they helped us create a writing center. So I would say the funding requirement is very low. It's the things that are free are the hardest to change.
That's exactly right.
And a viewer wants to know, what about schools that cannot afford mental health counselors and have limited budgets? I think what you said sort of speaks to that, but do you want to add anything about mental health counselors in schools?
So we do a partnership with Children's Nationwide Hospital. We do have a behavior therapist on site, and she works a lot with staff as well. So what I would say is to use your funding to get that professional development for staff, because what we came to understand is that they became trauma based on caring for those who have trauma. So it's like a caretaker sense of trauma. And so how do they heal, and how do they not become a victim of compassion fatigue? Because they're giving out so much of themselves. So I still think that you could do it in a capacity where you train your staff and then look for resources for those tiered supports. Any major hospital will have a unit that deals with adolescents, that deals with suicide, that deals with mental illness, and they will provide those services for free. So I would just be creative in your partnerships and say, hey, I want to do a relax and release day. Here's the local yoga company. Can you come in and do an hour of yoga for my girls? People will help, and then you can build from there.
I would also just say too, that in addition to those partnerships, that's also why the Ending Pushout Act is so important, because it does establish a federal sort of guideline for how schools can cultivate spaces that are geared toward healing, like Principal Patton is describing, rather than punishment. And it does include some incentives to support educators in that way. And funding.
One of our viewers had her second grade daughter's locker searched and repeatedly punished and accused of theft and various things, and has had to go to the superintendent and get her father involved, the daughter's grandfather involved. And she wants to know, is there a specific person in school administration that she should be going to talk about these types of disparities?
I think continuing the dialogue with the administrator and the staff, if they have an active PTO, be involved. And I think just come from a place of wanting to work together. Again, I think sometimes things in schools become so routine that we take the shortcut to the easiest way out. Let me go immediately. My instinct is to search a locker, or, I don't think, I would hope that it's not intentional for any educator, because we give so much that we're doing things to hurt children on purpose. So I think it's an awareness. And so if you can bring resources, to that principal and just offer those things, I think that's where you start, always at the building level. And then definitely escalate it if you feel that there's a disparity issue within that building, and address it as a disparity across the board in those generalized situations, so that it doesn't appear that it's just an isolated incident. I would look at trends and patterns and then just have an open and honest discussion.
The National Women's Law Center also has a toolkit that I think is particularly helpful to parents. It's called Let Her Learn. It's available in English and Spanish, available online at the National Women's Law Center website. So I would say take a look at that as well, because it does offer some concise questions around protections that might be helpful to the parent in this, as she seeks to approach the school and engage in the sort of reimagination of what should be taking place in that space.
And then I want the viewers to know that GlobeDocs sends an email out after, and you'll get, they'll ask Dr. Morris and Dr. Patton and Principal Patton for resources and reading lists and things like that that will be helpful to you. And we'll also answer questions about the link for the movie and studies that were mentioned in the conversation, which are widely available online.
And available at the pushoutfilm.com website. We did a bit of work to try to pull some pieces together. So if people just visit the pushoutfilm.com website, many of the things that we were talking about here today are available right there, or a link to them.
Again, that's pushoutfilm.com. So definitely visit them. And our last question before we close out and say thanks is, with COVID-19 and distance learning and virtual learning, it's definitely disproportionately affecting Black students and students of color. And then the disease itself is disproportionately affecting our community. What type of resource, a reader wants to know, what type of resources and focuses should we be directing on young Black students?
So what we're doing, that's a great question. What we're doing is focusing a lot on skill sets. And so those things that we're talking about, that's going to break that generational challenge and barriers that we have as African Americans. So let's talk about, organizing your day. Let's talk about how to juggle maybe responsibilities that you have in the household and your online learning. And so if parents can help with those things that they may not necessarily know the academic piece, but if you can help with those things that are going to help our children be successful, do health checks, so that we understand that because we have underlying conditions, how do we prevent those and how do we address those if we're students that have underlying conditions already? So that's one of the things, is we're focusing on skill sets. The academic achievement gap is always going to be there, at least in the near future, because we're not doing enough to address it. So I would say get the skill sets. And then from a curriculum standpoint, I think this is the greatest opportunity to dive into some of those cultural relevant lessons that we may not necessarily be able to cover in school. So right now we're doing Afrofuturism, and we're talking about what would the world be like without colonization. And these are things that they have access at home. They can watch, Wakanda, or they can do other research-based that's kind of engaging, because we know it's a different type of engagement at home than we are in the classroom. So you have the whole world right now as your classroom. And for those who don't have access, I think being creative and getting them access and making sure they have the skills, so that whenever we do return to some type of person-to-person education, that they're ready day one to be able to, catch up and still succeed in this environment.
I'm the executive director of Grant Makers for Girls of Color. That's what I do in my other, sort of wearing my other hat. But we actually launched a Love is Healing COVID-19 response fund that will allocate $1 million to organizations that are working around some of these issues and providing direct service and responses to girls of color. And I think it is important to think about how we do resource this moment to address some of the structural barriers. What's been clear is that the gaps that Principal Patton has been describing and that we've been talking about, and the particular risks, really, that these were pre-existing conditions to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we also recognize that much of what we're talking about with the disruptions in the lives of girls who are disproportionately experiencing pushout are about trauma. And our young people are going to be coming back to school from this pandemic having experienced a deep disruption and going to, in many ways, likely exhibit some of the symptoms of trauma. And so we're going to have to up our game ultimately as educators, as community, as the community of concerned adults who really want to show up differently. The one thing we didn't say that I think is really important, in addition to partnerships to move this work forward and to really think about how we build community, once we can be back in community together in person, but even online, is to volunteer, is to think about how we demonstrate our presence in the lives of young people through those wellness checks, through writing, through dance, through virtual engagement, using whatever pieces of technology young people use. If we know young people use their phones, let's do something that is phone-based so that young people can, really engage. But we are going to have to get creative to make sure that our young people stay connected so we don't continue to lose. We are unfortunately losing Black girls to suicide, Black girls to being impacted by this pandemic, particularly when they're at increased risk because their parents are first responders or essential workers, which we know are disproportionately Black and brown people. So I want to just elevate some of those things to recognize that we're working on it from a structural perspective, but there are things that we can do just to make sure our community is all right the way that we have for centuries before.
I want to thank you both. I feel like we could have talked for an hour. This was just a wonderful conversation. I want to thank our viewers and again, remind everybody, pushoutfilm.com has resources for you, and GlobeDocs will be sending an email out addressing reading materials in the website and the studies mentioned. And I want to close out with a quote that Principal Patton uses at her school, which is, your life is your story, write well, edit often. Everybody be safe, take care, thank you.
Thank you.